This edition of Tech Talk is brought to you by GlobalSpeak.com, new media consultants, corporate video and audio communications, video and audio production and distribution, live and virtual event production. Tag TV and Tag Radio is a service of GlobalSpeak.com, creatively delivering powerful marketing, video, and audio solutions. Jake, welcome to Tech Talk.
Hi, thank you. Glad to be here.
You know, pretty exciting times for you guys, although it's been that way, I think, probably for a pretty long time. I'm talking now when I first started hearing about data centers and or at least broad understanding of what was happening and what was going on, and certainly things like co-location and some of the earlier aspects of the evolution of what is now today, I think, whatever you want to call it. I want to use a term like backbone in the industry because that could connote a different connotation by the terminology. But, Jake, give us a little insight. A few years back, a couple of years forward, tell us a little bit about what you guys are into.
Sure, no problem. So dcBLOX, and it stands for, the DC stands for data center, and BLOX is our affiliation for the modular way that we build our data centers. We're using a modular enclosure. And the concept is not very old, in that the idea behind containing the equipment in an IT environment. A typical data center, people that have visited data centers might recall or know that when you go into a data center, it seems like a big, huge warehouse, right, in which air conditioning is running to try and keep everything cold. It's like cooling the entire room is like a refrigerator. And it's in order to keep the IT equipment performing at a cold temperature or not overheating. And the way that you do modular is that you're actually containing either the heat or the cold in a specified area so as to keep what needs to be cold that way. I mean, the concept's kind of like when you come home from the grocery store, you don't put the food on the countertop and turn down the air conditioning in your house. Instead, you open up the refrigerator, put it inside, and then close the door. And that's the same concept that we have. Our enclosures can hold anywhere from 14 rack cabinets up to 36 rack cabinets holding IT equipment. And what's unique in the way that we provide the support for the equipment is that we can provide higher power densities. So the typical data center is built to sustain power support and cooling support for a set amount, 6 kilowatts to 10 kilowatts per rack cabinet. And we can do 5 times the power support for a rack cabinet. And that's really important nowadays because there's a certain area inside IT called hyper-converged information systems. Companies like Nutanix or EMC's VX Rails or HP's Apollo systems are hyper-converged systems, meaning that the storage, the compute, the networking, all are integrated into one system such that it becomes very easy to virtualize. You can basically create a cloud in a box. But if you put a rack full of those kinds of devices, the power draw can be significant, anywhere from 3 to 4 times the kind of power output that a typical data center can support. And so since we can support even higher power densities, it's perfect for being able to support those kinds of architectures. And then what we've done, we can envision that with that kind of equipment, how would we want to build a data center? How would we want it to support? We'd want it to not only be able to provide that capacity of cooling, but also be very efficient. And so we're 80% more efficient than the typical data center with this kind of containment approach. But not stopping there, with that infrastructure, you also want to be able to move your data from one place to the other. And so we put in our own private optical network at 100 gigabits per second. And just to give you an idea there, if you're using Comcast and maybe you get 50 megabits, service at home, this is 200 times that kind of level of bandwidth. And that kind of bandwidth is important because if you're moving large files, like a terabyte, and what's a terabyte? It's the kind of hard drive you might have in a typical desktop or laptop computer. If you've got 4 terabytes of data, you're trying to move it from one place to the next, and you're moving it on a 1 gigabit circuit, it could take, all day to be able to move that kind of data. And with our kind of configuration at 100 gigabits, we can move that in about 5 minutes. and gives you kind of a scale idea.
Well,
and on top of that, that network infrastructure, we then put in place our ability to run a virtual environment, so that we are offering not only the co-location, a place where you can put your equipment, but also a virtualized setup that can move the data very quickly between places, such that, as I like to say, it's one data center that just happens to sit in multiple cities.
Well, obviously, the focus on the segment that you're talking about is unique. I'm assuming that is it as broad as say, let's mention a couple of industry. Would you include healthcare and gaming and even e-commerce within the context of the target vendor, the target customer that you work with?
Yes, I mean it's essentially an incredibly broad area, because data and workload support from IT is encompassing it's a requirement in so many different industries. And so we kind of like to say, instead of focusing on one particular vertical, we're just looking at customers that want to reduce their risk of downtime. It used to be that it used to hug your server and be somebody says, I want to know where that IT equipment is located and be able to control it. But nowadays, the server hugger of old is giving over to the data hugger. I want to know where my data is. I want to know how available my data is, because that's really the chief aspect of it. And so we're trying to support those customers who want to reduce the risk of not being able to have access to their data by being able to support redundant locations of it. I'll tell you, if a certain airline had redundant systems in place, they might not be sitting on a $150 million pre-tax hit. And I know that they're addressing that quickly, but it's becoming more apparent, almost every month, where a data outage is having a major impact to consumers or industry. And so that's where we put our focus.
Well, certainly with the Internet of Things and with the connectivity of the immediate, I'm not even going to talk about the near future, because I think it's all in process of getting all of the dots connected, literally, figuratively. I'm going to say that downtime could be critical in a healthcare situation as much as it is in an e-commerce one, as far as potentially losing sales. That said, let's talk a little bit, because you guys are right where the tire meets the road, and the other side of it also is that you're competing with a unique selling proposition. So I'm going to assume that understanding the market and really knowing not only your customer base, but the potential of where growing and developing business lies. Let's talk a little bit about trends. Let's go into IT products and services. What are you seeing as far as the near future is concerned in the market?
Well, you've heard of the trend of something called the Internet of Things, or as other companies might call it, the industrial internet, which is this a connectivity level that is really surpassing in the amount of data that is being passed back and forth between different devices in order to support an improvement of productivity or of being able to provide preventative maintenance. And it's being able to have a multiplicative effect on information, on data that's being stored and having to be retrieved and analyzed. For example, GE has gas turbines that generate hundreds of megawatts of power. Each one of those turbines generates a terabyte of data a day. So you can imagine the amount of data that has to be archived and retrieved and analyzed to be able to do preventative maintenance. And that's kind of the goal. Be able to have that jet engine or that turbine be able to say, I'm going to need some maintenance in a week. Please get all the components and everything together so that we can schedule that downtime. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the whole dream of the Holy Grail inside what the Internet of Things can provide, a seamlessness of the way things can operate. And that's a huge trend. And the need for greater amounts of data transfer or bandwidth is really kind of critical in that regard. Because if you're trying to move large data sets, whether it be credit card transactions, healthcare records, any kind of data that you might be able to imagine, video files.
Run an entire plant. I mean,
exactly.
I think most people underestimate, I don't think most people, but I think as we get an understanding of quote-unquote invisible computers and the reality of of what the Internet of Things could potentially mean, it certainly isn't going to happen unless you've got a dcBLOX type of situation behind you, because as you mentioned earlier, downtime takes on a completely different function when everything is so interrelated and interconnected. It's not just about your refrigerator ordering your groceries. It's about entire plants and operations being totally automated and running by machines that educate themselves as they complete their task. Correct? I'm
That's
stumbling
correct.
around.
And so the whole idea behind it is making sure that you've got redundancy in order to, whether you have, dual workload processors or you have dual paths for being able to move your information. A level of redundancy is required because entropy happens, right? Things break down, things evolve over time. And that's why IT's life is about, 3 years. But when we were looking at our plan, our consideration was, the data center market has really been focused in large metro areas that have kind of become the tier 1 cities, places like Dallas, Texas, or Los Angeles, or Washington, D.C., Chicago, and to some extent, here in Atlanta as well. You've got just a large amount of data centers that are available because of the kind of the crossroads, the junction points where the fiber systems intersect. But you see the demand out there in tier 2 markets, and just looking in the southeast alone, in Nashville and Birmingham, and Winston-Salem, Little Rock, there's a growing capacity for this kind of redundant support. But yet there's not that, there's the demand, there's just not the capacity is what I mean. And that's what our approach was. Because of our modular concept, we can build a data center extremely inexpensively and be able to implement it in as little as 5 months. And what that means is that now we can go in, bring that kind of capacity to a market, and do so at a cost that would be prohibitive for any of the major providers. And so we're bringing a capacity for being able to add redundancy to anybody's manufacturing, healthcare, medical record, entertainment industry or market, and be able to support them with the kind of level of redundancy by getting them onto our network and being able to now distribute the backups in such a way that they would be able to have availability of their data, 100% of the time, virtually.
Yeah, I think you have to say literally. I'm not sure virtually. Can you describe it as virtual in terms of all the way virtual is being used today? One of the things we joke about, Jake, is that semantics never keep up with the speed of technology anymore. It's getting hard to, when we even talk about clouds, it wasn't all that long ago. It meant something completely different. Let's touch upon that a little bit, because obviously it's everywhere, and everything you're talking about is centered around the reality that you could say black hole. You have to be careful, because that even describes something completely different than a cloud, but it certainly is seemingly absorbing everything around it and making it now things capable like the IoT that we talked about earlier. You guys obviously are offering cloud service. How do you differentiate yourself? And I guess the bottom line would be most amateurs looking at it that are not in the trenches like you guys are in providing the service. How in the world do you compete in a market where Amazon is so dominant?
Right. It's interesting because, the providers of the market, the leading ones, Amazon being the big gorilla, you've got Microsoft Azure, you've got Google further down the road. But you've got a need for being able to utilize something on a demand basis, turn it up, turn it down, being very flexible. And what we found, though, is that there are these hidden costs that are inside the use of those applications. So that $45 a month cost that you thought you were going to be paying for, that virtual machine out on Amazon ends up being like $600, $700 a month, because you're getting all these charges associated with pulling data out. If you're running a SQL database on that virtual cloud and you're pulling information every time you're transferring data out of that machine, you got a toll charge going on, and it starts to rack up. And that's why we decided that the way to differentiate was really had to do with also the way that you're distributing the data and being able to deliver a transport of that data. So we offered, by having our own private optical network, we're able to offer the connectivity such that bandwidth can be measured in 5 terabytes to 10 terabytes a month. Somebody would be hard-pressed to be able to pull that amount of data out of the virtual machine in a month, but it can happen. And if it does, there's no toll charge using our system. And even if there was, if it got to a point where, that kind of a fixed plan wasn't going to be able to support you, we offer through our ability to provision bandwidth on our network a way to be able to let that customer have unlimited, downloading and uploading capability via our network. So it's kind of like, like a cell phone might have, or a cell phone provider might have a fixed plan and an unlimited plan. We're doing the same thing, and that's a way to differentiate out there in the cloud space.
Well, one of the things also we mention occasionally here, and that is that so many people, there was an old Steve Jobs comment that said people don't know what they want until they see it. Well, there's so many first-generation entrepreneurs and the change that we live in, they really don't even know they have a problem. I mean, not necessarily directly related to you, but say, for example, in the case of hacking, in a lot of cases they don't even have the technology to identify the fact that they've been hacked, no less the fact that they want to prevent themselves from that happening in the first place. My point being is that a lot of business leaders don't know what's out there and how it can impact their business. Take a minute and think about the fact that we've got some listeners that are potentially key customers that know they've got a challenge, know they've got a problem, but aren't sure exactly what it is. dcBLOX, what's the value proposition that your customers would receive? And, kind of give me a couple of, like an elevator pitch, if you would, that you were talking to a decision maker in terms of potentially using you versus, obviously, the many data centers that are seemingly popping up all over Atlanta.
Right. Now, the easiest way for us to describe it is that, like I was saying earlier, we offer one data center that happens to reside in multiple cities. What that means is just as easily as somebody can move data from one room in their existing data center to another, we can move it across a geographically diverse location. For example, we can move data, in milliseconds between our Atlanta data center and our data center in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And up there, be able to provide a virtual backup or disaster recovery situation that allows the customer to have the confidence in knowing that they can recover their systems as quickly as possible. Plus, we also have this focus on reduced cost, and that's part of the biggest issue. If you've got a data center and the limit is on the space and power that this data center was designed for, it means that any time that you expand, you're adding more storage or more compute, that data center is going to tell you, sorry, you've reached your limit for the one cabinet, now you've got to add another. And what we do is we reduce that kind of data center sprawl that can happen where, after, a year, suddenly this customer's looking at, they didn't think they had that much data stored in, but yet they've got, a $40,000 a month bill suddenly. And what we're talking about is being able to put into one rack cabinet the kind of power density that other companies can't support. And that way reduce the amount of cost because we're offering you the wholesale pricing down at the retail level. And the second thing that we do is we're extremely efficient. We're 80% more efficient than the standard data center, so it costs less for us to operate our facilities. And on top of that, the cloud systems that we're providing are open source. The OpenStack configuration is enterprise grade. It's in use by Bank of America, Northwestern Mutual, AT&T, American Express. I mean, these big names, with, a high need for reliable systems. And yet our OpenStack system is the same as being supporting that these organizations are using. And you don't have to pay the virtual or the VMware licensing fees that typically come with those kind of off-the-shelf systems. And so our focus is reducing the cost, improving the efficiency, and improving the redundancy level such that you always have the availability of your data.
It fits the criteria from the old school that says you either save me money or make me money. When you've got a situation the way you're describing, obviously it's doing a lot more than even that, and that's doing a lot. Hey, lots of buzz and lots of talk going on as far as dcBLOX are concerned. I know you guys are hot. Jake, thank you so much for taking time out of what I know is a crazy schedule of yours, but to spend a couple of minutes and give us some insight into what you're doing and about the whole space, and taking a few minutes to join us today on Tech Talk.
Hey, I truly appreciate it. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been, a real pleasure, and I look forward to doing it again sometime down the road.